So environmental standards, labor standards, child labor law, how do we go about doing these types of things? Economists argue whether these measures are really effective. And there seems to be a power issue with the high-income country kind of dominating the discussion, dominating the argument. And so that's a reoccurring theme here, is that there's probably, in some cases, larger gains for the low-income country to engage in trade, but they don't have maybe the infrastructure in place. And should we, in a sense, hold that against them in terms of engaging in trade? So, give that a read. What's the issue here? Give me an argument or an example that makes it a hazy borderline. You can make one up, you can kind of think. What is protectionism?
I guess you could go with the intellectual property argument, like when we are concerned about rewarding the people that come up with the ideas or whatever, and it goes kind of between the borderline of, okay, are we really protecting them, keeping them away from market forces, or are we helping them out because...
Right. Yeah, so we can kind of use that argument to our advantage, and it's hard to tell whether we're well-intentioned or we're just trying to cover our own butts, right? And so that's where it gets kind of gray. Are we really trying to protect the innocent in the other country, or are we trying to protect ourselves? Not real cut and dry. So what would that specific content be? So there is no international agreement on the specific content and language of labor standards. How could that cause problems? Taylor, number between 10 and 16. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Max?
You mind repeating the question?
So, just wondering what comes to mind for you with specific content. So the specific content of labor standards, why would that be a potential issue?
Flow of labor and like the way labor standards are vary through culture, nation. It's hard to like.
Okay.
I guess.
So try to get just whatever comes to mind. I know I'm putting you on the spot, but give me something really specific that you think.
Oh, an example?
Yeah. Just trying to think.
So like sweatshops.
Okay. More specific. What about the sweatshops? Get inside a sweatshop. What are you seeing?
Ages 5 to 10, children being.
Okay. So some child labor.
Child labor.
And what are those 5 children doing in the sweatshop that you're looking at?
They're being overworked.
Okay.
In bad conditions.
And in bad conditions, what are those conditions? Give me one of those bad conditions.
No air conditioning.
Okay, no air. Perfect. That's exactly the type of thing I wanted to really drill down to, because we kind of stay lofty up here sometimes, right? And we think, oh, it's just poor labor standards. Well, you know what I mean. No, what do you mean exactly? Does the the air conditioning have to be at, 70? Is that the standard, right? Or does it have to be 68 degrees or 64 degrees, right? So when we start drilling down to specifics, it gets even more difficult, especially country to country, culture to culture, on what those standards should be. They're really specific to a culture, and how we would write that into law becomes very difficult, right? So that's a trouble with that. Okay, trade wars, sanctions are discriminatory, so you are specifically singling out a country for maybe other reasons too, that say why we don't like those Cubans, and that's not right the way they treat their people. So in theory, countries cannot simultaneously capture markets, run a trade surplus. What's a trade surplus mean? Trade surplus. Export more than import, good. And attract foreign investment. So having foreign investment come in. This is our Chapter 9 material, and we'll get into that in more detail, but we can talk about it here. If you have a trade surplus, then what must be going on? You're exporting more than you're importing. And so what completes the puzzle? If you're exporting more goods to foreigners than what you're buying from them, who owes money to who?
They owe money.
They owe money? Or we owe money to them? So we're so if it was a fair trade, hey, I'll give you my stuff, you give me your stuff. But now we're selling them more stuff than what we're getting from them. So who owes whom?
The other country would owe the country that's running a trade surplus.
Okay, so let me do it a little differently. United States runs a trade surplus or deficit?
Deficit.
Deficit. We import more than we export. And so what does China do? Do they invest in us so that we owe them, or they owe us? Who owes who? We owe them, right? Which means they invested in us, essentially. So we owe them money because we bought more stuff than we gave them. So that's this relationship here, and we'll explore that more as we get into Chapter 9. Okay, so whether this standards race to the bottom exists is kind of a question mark. Here's some evidence. So, are these people who race to the bottom and win? Yay, I win! Or wait, there was that video. Yay, I win! I won. I lowered my standards all the way down to here. Do they see a big influx of companies coming in? No. So why is this part important? Low labor standards are correlated with this stuff. What else does that imply for the company?
There's no incentive for them to invest.
Why? I agree.
No infrastructure.
Right? And what does that lead to?
Demand.
Think more on the supply side, the cost side.
It's more expensive to supply.
It's more expensive, right? So you got these offsetting things. Labor cost is just one part of the cost equation. So if I have, for instance, a 50-50 deal, where I use 50% labor and I use 50% other things in the production of my good, and I can make it in America and pay people $10 an hour, or I can make it in Mexico and pay people $2 an hour. So I've got a huge savings, right, in labor, dropping from $10 an hour to $2 an hour. But if it costs me extra to buy trucks to go over dirt roads and gravel, and they break down more frequently, and I can't get my product to the market, and I can't do this and I can't do that because of all these other things, that cost could quickly overwhelm the labor savings. And that's in general what's found. That's the evidence that's found around the world, is that those sorts of costs tend to outweigh the cheap labor argument. Okay. So, how about those dirty, rich old countries exporting pollution? Have you heard of that story before? You might have heard that maybe, but I haven't heard it for a while, honestly. But that was a perception before.
It's kind of what people say about what happened to Shanghai, I believe was in China.
Mm-hmm.
And how you basically, well, I mean, you can't kind of eat their air.
Mm-hmm. So,
Los Angeles.
man, this is a stinky type of production process. Let's just make it over in that guy's backyard instead, right? That was the idea. These pollution havens being created through the global market phase. And again, the thought is the rich taking advantage of the poor. So, back in the 70s, there was some countries that have done that. But again, economists who researched this found that there wasn't any evidence that that was going on. So sometimes there's a lot of talk and not as much action as what's implied. So when you hear the word spillover, there's kind of a fancy economic word that's linked to.
Externality.
Good. Externalities. Boy, Max, I don't know if I'm feeling generous, but it's just a good rapid fire. Externalities.
Appreciate that, Russ.
You're in the book. All right. So the spillover effect, something economists look at, right? Are there things either positive or negative that spill over? We talk about knowledge spillovers on the good part, and pollution on the bad part. So, is this argument just another thing for protection? Argument for protection. All right, last things here. Here's some things that have been thought of. Labeling. It's good enough for me, it's good enough for you. And then let's just talk about it. So those are the three categories here. Put a label on it. We did that with food in the United States. It worked pretty well, see? You just tell people that this was produced with safe measures, right? So that can be an effective way to reduce asymmetric information. What does this one sound like? Requiring home country standards.
So like China has to produce according to our environmental regulations.
Yeah, yep. And it's kind of closely related to something else with tariffs that we learned about. I don't remember what chapter, to be honest with you. Yeah, good. Ooh, man, I don't know. That's another. I wasn't really expecting somebody to pull that out like that. Taylor, most favored nation status. So, however you treat another country is the way you got to treat everybody, right? So the way you treat yourself here, that's the way it's got to be in the other country. All right, so let's take a look at these. What's some problems possibly with the labeling concept? So over in Cambodia, they've been known for some child labor and other things. They export stuff to the U.S. like Starbucks coffee. What are some potential issues with labeling? How is it? What are some things that need to be true for it to work, I guess, is one way to look at it. Integrity.
You kind of need a standard, like the stuff on the back of those labels, the serving size mixes or can be changed easily. It allows a set of what the actual serving size is, so you can basically rely on.
Right. So you got to have a little confidence in the label and that it wasn't there, that it wasn't fraudulent. Otherwise, it's kind of a waste of time and a waste of money, right? And there's another policeman that needs to police the international community to make sure the proper labels were on there, and it might be a little easier said than done. What does this one mean here? An infringement on their sovereignty. We don't talk about that one quite as much. There's a few times that comes up.
Basically, like their right to not have to say everything they're doing.
So yeah, individual liberty, right? But this in kind of the country sense that we've got our own rules. What do you mean we're not good enough? You know, for your, we want to do it this way, and you can take it or leave it. Okay. So it's kind of nice. If we force countries to use their own standards, we might help stop that race to the bottom, because then we know what the standard is. Whatever it is over there is what we have to abide by. So, can you think of any cons against that?
Maybe like cultural differences.
Okay. Like what? I agree.
Like if one country feels like they do it this way and that's the way they've already done it, and the home country comes in and tries to make them do something else.
Right.
Maybe cause tension there.
Right. Could be some battles starting up between the two countries and possibly lead to just anti-trade type of behavior as well. Well, we're just not going to do it if we're not good enough for you. All right. Negotiations. What do you think? Some pros and cons to that? International Labor Organization, another international type group. Anything strike you as bad there, or maybe good? I've got a problem with it. I might even be able to be smoothed over on this one, but
It is going to create a regulation industry that's going to create its own little mess of problems and have itself invested in.
I think so. I see this happen. This is just kind of a normal path that places go through. So I've shared with some of you guys in different classes, or this one on the landlord code up in Ames where I was at. So landlord tenant law, and the city was responding to whatever. I guess sometimes it was the conditions of properties and other neighbors not thinking that a landlord keeps their property up good enough, and in other cases there might have been some tenants who were disgruntled with their landlord, which is pretty common, by the way. There's nothing harder to do than property management, I think, in terms of keeping everybody happy. I think it's about impossible. So you start down this path of, well, let's get the landlords together and some tenant groups and the city council and the city planner, and let's all lock you in a room and you guys, come to an agreement, come to negotiations, put something down on paper. So I got selected to this committee, or I guess I don't know if I volunteered or how exactly I got on that thing, but somehow I got on it, and I was even a bit naive to, it sounded like something I wanted to be a part of so that I could hopefully steer some things to my own self-interest or the landlord. I was kind of representing the landlord interest, and I think there might have been another owner in there too. And what seemed like it was innocent enough to kind of get some things down on paper so that we all have, well, a year later, we thought it was going to be like a couple meetings. We met continuously for a year, and we still didn't have it done. And I moved away from Ames, and they were still working on it. And so what seems like an easy thing, especially at the international level, would be extremely complex when you start to try to codify some of these concepts. And so
Not to mention the amount of grandfathered things and loophole things that you're gonna have.
all that kind of stuff. And that's what we got into exactly was, well, new construction is this, but what if I've got an old house? Then what do we do? Oh, well, I understand. Yeah, we'll kind of grandfather that. And then it was a continual conversation. We went through all the building codes and all the various other sorts of rules and regulations, and that's all it was. And it's just you can't plan your way through that and really have something meaningful at the end other than a document this thick that nobody reads anyway, until there's a lawsuit, and then maybe they go to section code of this. Well, you see, at this meeting we all agreed to this. So I'm not a big fan of things like that. I think it tends to be ineffective, and I'm not so sure we don't have something there with a general guidelines and a code of ethics, and we kind of deal with the bad apples and we deal with things as they come up, but maybe try to avoid some of this when we can. And maybe there's elements here that would work, but okay, let's get to our debate. So if you pull out a piece of paper, you guys be turning this in. It's just about an 8-minute video. And so what I'd recommend is as we're watching the video, jot down some talking points. And so what you can think about is, well, this is how I would respond to that part of it. And just kind of make some points to yourself and kind of give me a dialogue, and then after the video is done, maybe you can go back to those points and expand them. But as you're watching it, just kind of take some notes of, oh, I want to reference that, and just take a few notes that way, and then you'll do a short little write-up. Any questions before we start? Okay. This will be fun. You guys can be debating this guy here. Let's see, there it is. Jobs disappear as America races to the bottom. I think there's going to be a commercial.
Like most Kansans, you've seen your electricity bills keep
here's
rising.
the scheme.
Ever wondered why?
Okay.
Before Kathleen Sebelius went to
When I did
Washington,
this earlier, I don't think the option to skip. Oh, you know what? I'm going to open up this on Chrome. You've seen this one?
No,
I've seen her before. This is another interesting business thing. How pretty sure Chrome makes it better. Their stuff run better on their.
At Vincent Mortgage, our main focus is customer service and fast, trouble-free closings. We're closing loans on an average.
All right, here we go.
Now, politicians absolutely love to talk about reviving those manufacturing gigs, bringing back Made in America, campaigning on promises to restore an area where this country was once greatest. But promises are promises, and numbers, unfortunately, are somewhat grim. In 2009, the number of unemployed Americans was bigger than the entire number of people working in the manufacturing sector. And over the past decades, the United States has lost an average of 50,000 manufacturing jobs per month. I mean, is that really something that we can turn around? Or are we victims of yet more political rhetoric? Well, with me to break it all down is Bill Fletcher Jr. He is a co-author of the book Solidarity Divided, The Crisis in Organized Labor and a New Path Towards Social Justice. And he also chairs the board of directors for the International Labor Rights Forum. Bill, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
You know, it seems to me like almost every single week we see the president visiting some nice factory in the middle of America somewhere where he promises to work really hard to keep those jobs from going overseas. But at the same time, the facts show that those jobs are going overseas. I mean, we lost something, 5.5 million manufacturing jobs, that's nearly 32% of America's total, have gone abroad since 2000. Is this rhetoric, or are these politicians actually working to change this trend?
Well, some are and some aren't. I mean, first of all, this decline in manufacturing is something that you begin to see in the late 50s, actually. But it reached a crisis point in the early 80s, and has been, increasing ever since. The problem is that we're dealing with a globalized economy. We're dealing with politicians who are more concerned about deficits than putting investment into the creation of new infrastructure, new manufacturing. So as long as the main discussion is deficits, you're not going to see any policies that really focus on the creation of manufacturing jobs.
But what's to blame for that? I mean, these jobs are, well, first of all, you talked about an investment in infrastructure. I think there was a recent report that said something like $2 trillion it would cost to get our infrastructure to be on par with the BRIC countries, Brazil and China and India. But it's very difficult for a politician, it seems, to decide, hey, I'm going to spend more money on something now that's going to give me long-term benefits when they're running for office every few years.
That's true. But part of what we've noticed over the last number of years is the rise in the importance of finance. And finance has eclipsed manufacturing, so there's more money that's being produced for the rich through the manipulation of money, investment, speculation, etc., as opposed to thinking about long-term investment. And when you have companies that really put down the long-term and really looking for immediate turnaround in profits, there's no incentive for management to think about, okay, what we're going to look at is rebuilding Camden, New Jersey, and what will that take? And maybe we will not get the kind of super profits in for another 10 years. So you need a very different approach towards economic development. And in the United States, there's this almost allergic reaction to the idea of planning, which is what we really need. We need a manufacturing plan that looks at not just the currently depressed areas, but the historically depressed areas.
And as soon as you say something like that on the mainstream networks, they're like, well, China, 5-year plan, my goodness, you're communist socialist, how dare you bring that up? But I mean, isn't this discussion also missing the broader point, which is, it's not that these companies are bad guys who are just seeking the buck. I mean, you and I, or myself, I mean, I don't want to pay a lot of money for this. I don't want to pay a lot of money for the TV screens and all of the goods that are made cheaper abroad. Aren't we as consumers in a consumer culture responsible for this trend?
Yes and no. I mean, I don't mean to equivocate, but the reality is that we are in this race to the bottom. So what we find ourselves in a situation where you and I are looking for cheaper goods, which is logical, but in looking for cheaper goods, we're looking for goods that are produced in places other than the United States for the most part. We're not thinking about what that's going to mean, what the ripple effects are for our local economies, until it has an effect on us, until we lose that auto plant because we're buying cars from somewhere else. We lose a textile plant because they moved to the Dominican Republic or China.
I mean, hasn't it had that effect already? Aren't we there?
Yes, and that's why it's getting worse. And until we have a situation where we have political leaders that have the courage to say, we need a plan. We need to rebuild our Camdens, our Detroits, our East St. Louis's. Until we have politicians that are saying, we're going to do that, despite the opposition from Wall Street, we're going to see a continual slide.
well, I'm not going to hold my breath until they do that, unfortunately. But you also hear a lot of these folks say that there's a shortage of skilled labor in the United States, right? And I want to get your thoughts on this. I mean, isn't that kind of just a euphemism for I don't want to pay more for certain jobs? I mean, if I don't want to pay $9.99 for diamonds, it doesn't mean that there's a shortage of diamonds. So part of the issue is that we're not really willing to compensate workers justly necessarily for their efforts.
Absolutely, and also what happens is that the owners are looking for how can they produce without putting the investment in to bringing forward new workers, the kind of preparatory work. It's like in baseball. It's easier for a baseball owner to say, we're going to grab a pitcher from Cuba who has been brought up in the Cuban system. We didn't put any money into their training, but we're going to grab them and bring them into our system so that our team succeeds. As opposed to saying, what are we doing in the streets of New York and San Francisco to produce younger players? It comes back to the short-term turnaround. We've got to get the profit now, as opposed to saying, no, this is a long-term commitment.
Totally back to the Cuban player analogy. I mean, we also have a shortage of the skilled worker visa, so we're not necessarily helping this country develop economically in that sense, too.
Exactly, and so what they do is that they'll bring skilled workers from other countries and it's not to put down skilled workers from other countries, but it is to say that there are many workers here that would love the opportunity to work in the computer industry, for example. But when you have declining schools and when you have a failure to put money into public education, you're not going to have the kind of workers that you need for a 21st century economy.
Well, it's unfortunately a dire situation, and it remains to be seen whether we can turn it around. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That was Bill Fletcher.
Okay. You guys do your writing, and when you're done, you can leave.
What's the write-up again?
So I want you to basically take those points, and I'll run it again if you want me to while you're writing. I don't mind playing it again. But I want you to do a write-up to kind of debate the points that you took down on items that he said that maybe an economist might disagree with. So you're debating, you're kind of bringing up the counter arguments to what he brought up. And it's okay if you want to support a little bit of his points, but I'm looking for the counter arguments to that. I'll just let it play again.
Now, politicians absolutely love to talk about reviving those men.
Oh, is this the... Yeah, that wasn't thrown. That's fine.
Now, politicians absolutely love to talk about reviving those manufacturing gigs, bringing back Made in America, campaigning on promises to restore an area where this country was once greatest. But promises are promises, and numbers, unfortunately, are somewhat grim. In 2009, the number of unemployed Americans was bigger than the entire number of people working in the manufacturing sector. And over the past decades, the United States has lost an average of 50,000 manufacturing jobs per month. I mean, is that really something that we can turn around? Or are we victims of yet more political rhetoric? Well, with me to break it all down is Bill Fletcher Jr. He is a co-author of the book Solidarity Divided, The Crisis in Organized Labor and a New Path Towards Social Justice. And he also chairs the board of directors for the International Labor Rights Forum. Bill, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
It seems to me like almost every single week we see the president visiting some nice factory in the middle of America somewhere where he promises to work really hard to keep those jobs from going overseas. But at the same time, the facts show that those jobs are going overseas. I mean, we lost something 5